So there are these different types of phosphorus compounds. If you move into fertility, we'll kind of go over these a little bit more, but just to understand that there's going to be these primary and secondary minerals that are formed with phosphorus. So calcium phosphates or iron phosphates and aluminum phosphates. Y'all remember what the pH was for the balance between H2PO4 negative and HPO4 2 negative? But there was a specific pH that I mentioned though. It's at 7.2. So remember the, right there, that right about 7.2 is where we find that happy medium between those two phosphates, right? And so depending on which one it is, we start getting into different calcium and aluminum phosphates. Aluminum and iron are going to dominate our more highly weathered soils, so probably more acidic, and calcium obviously is going to dominate our alkaline soils because we've got lime there, right? There's some calcium that is causing that pH to increase. The solubility of some of those inorganic P's, depending on which types of other cations are in soil solution, determine which type of mineral that is formed, whether it's stringite or variscite or dical, monocal. So here, this is why that 3 sources of pH dependent charge is important, because that's where we're holding on to our phosphorus. So those aluminum and iron oxides and the broken edges of clays. We can have some outer sphere complexes. And y'all remember, have I discussed what the difference between those is? Inner sphere and outer sphere? I think I went over that Wednesday. The inner sphere is kind of like a magnet on the outside of that clay layer, but, outer sphere on the outside of the clay layer, kind of like a magnet. In the inner sphere, they form that covalent bond. And so it's harder to break that covalent bond than it is to break the force of that attraction. Just a couple of the different types of minerals that we would have more clay P fixation as we start to get into allophane and some of the more crystalline oxides that we have not talked about. That's a whole mineralogy, geology type thing. That's like soils 3. Yeah, right. But they're like, those are the types of things that in that name, in that nomenclature, that we can tell whether or not we would have high fixation of this material. Not that you would need to know this, but just to understand that we would have the least P fixation in our 1-to-1s and 2-to-1 clays. And so the fixation is going to be the lowest between 6 and 7 because we have more availability, and there's a shift in speciation. Remember we talked about that 7.2 is like the 50-50. So as we start getting over into 6, we start having more H2PO4 negative because our soils are becoming more pH wise. They're becoming more acidic or alkaline, going from 7 to 6. More acidic. And so we're starting to have a little greater solubility there. And I think I remember Stephen asking me about the difference in MAP and DAP, and we talked about that on the board about which type of phosphorus speciation is used for each one of those. I think what's going to be most important in here in understanding about this phosphorus is, soil pH management, because we need our phosphorus to be soluble and then available so that the plant can take it up. But that mycorrhizal symbiosis is going to be important. And so I think this was going all the way back to microorganisms, and we talked about endomycorrhiza, which is kind of on the top, like the outside, they form that fungal mantle, and then ectomycorrhiza, which is inside the cortical cell. So it's like a straight shot, and that endomycorrhiza can absorb that phosphorus off of the soil colloids. Is that it? Was there anything I had that needed to be? Nope. Okay. And then finally, the last major macronutrient that we're going to talk about for our plant growth is going to be potassium. We've been discussing this all semester with our fertilizer calculations. On the bag is N, P2O5, and K2O. The primary influence on potassium is going to be cation exchange. And potassium is a +1 cation. So kind of easily adsorbed and exchanged into the soil solution. One of the best things about potassium is that it does not have a negative influence on our environment. It's not toxic, there's no eutrophication, it doesn't volatilize, there's nothing wrong with it that we should be concerned about. Is there anything on that slide? But it is very important in nutrition. And so when I think about potassium, I think about Gatorade or Powerade. It's an electrolyte. So it's going to balance some of those enzymes, the cellular activity. We get a little bit of energy when we drink Gatorade. It changes that osmotic potential. And primarily, there are a couple of things that I believe potassium is most important for. Is going to be that osmotic water potential and release of water out of the stomata. Because it's a salt, it's the electrolyte, and so it kind of balances that out. And when that's balanced out, and the water is more adsorbed to that potassium, it does not leave out of the stomata. And we want to keep our water inside of our plant. Good, Grayson. Outside of that, potassium is to the plant what vitamin C is to humans. It's what kind of gives our immune system the ability to adapt and overcome any kind of stress. So drought tolerance, because it retains water in there. And then winter hardiness as well, because it's going to kind of, salt water is hard to freeze. But it's easy to boil, right? If you ever want to boil spaghetti faster, put some salt in the water. The water boils quicker. So to me, it kind of allows the plant to be able to handle any of those environmental extremes. Drought, winter hardiness, things like that. This mask sucks. These cloth masks are horrible. Again, resistance to fungal disease and pest tolerance. So that's like being able to handle some of our biotic factors. Healthy plants can grow quicker. They can outgrow these fungal diseases. It's important for our flowers, fruits, and vegetables if you go into that realm. You'll typically see phosphorus deficiencies along the edges of the plant. They look burnt. They'll be crisp and kind of rolled up, a little kind of brown like a paper bag. You can see right here. That little browning and burning of the leaves. So the thing about potassium is that Because we mentioned that the cation exchange is what is dictating plant uptake. And we don't have any mineral breakdown of our primary or secondary potassium minerals, then we have to apply fertilizer. So we are supplying K2O as that exchangeable potassium on soil colloids. So that's important for our CEC. We need to have a higher CEC to adsorb this potassium. So if it's maintained in that mineral structure, which we didn't really go over very much because there's a long chemical equation for that, but if it's inside that mineral structure, it has to undergo a weathering process. So pretty much unavailable. The plant can't just take that out of that chemical structure. It has to be broken down, decomposed, form a new mineral, and then the plant can take that up. Forms that secondary mineral, the secondary mineral breaks down, finally becomes plant available, and then the plant can then adsorb it into its tissues. So after going through the nitrogen cycle and the sulfur cycle and the phosphorus cycle, this one looks pretty easy, right? It's pretty much just adsorption and desorption and plant uptake. There aren't many other losses. Now there can be some leaching if you get an abundance of water or we start changing our pH to become more acidic, then we would have more positive charges, which would allow that potassium to leak because like charges don't attract each other. One of the things about phosphorus, about potassium, is this plant uptake and removal. And so there can be this luxury consumption where plants will just continue to take that up whether they need it or not. So it moves into the plant through mass flow. It's in the water because it's soluble. And so when it's soluble, it just kind of moves in as a solute in the water as it's taking it up out of the soil. But there won't be any toxicity. It just takes it up just because it's there. And we call that luxury consumption. That's like just being able to eat it because you can. But the thing is that it can also be trapped in those inner layers. And so you may apply a bunch of potassium, and you may continue to apply potassium, but the plant might not take it up because it's fixed in those clay layers. So there's this thing about quantity and intensity. It's more like concentration. We go over that in fertility. But the more that is available, the more the plant is going to take up. So there's no need to over-apply this fertilizer just for the sake of applying it. Even though it's not toxic to the environment, it doesn't have any detrimental effect, the more that's there, the more it's going to take up. Our readily available forms are going to be adsorb more to the soil colloids, and our slow available forms are going to be released or fixed potassium. And then just to look at some of the other things that are going to influence this fixation, soil pH is going to be kind of the biggest thing, and then also soil type. Any of this on there? So potassium is one of those elements that you can apply after you've planted, and you'll still get a response from it. So for whatever reason, if you didn't get your potassium out because we were too busy applying nitrogen, like just because you didn't get your potassium out doesn't mean it's going to be a problem. Like you can still go back and reapply. You can still go back and apply that, and it will be available to the plant within a couple of weeks or so. And if there's already potassium in the soil, it's just going to be an exchange. The plant will take what it needs from that soil colloid, and when you go to apply potassium fertilizer, that potassium fertilizer will dissolve, break down, and then be adsorbed to the soil colloid, and the plant can then take that up at a later date. You almost kind of want that. We need to have that movement of our nutrients from soil to plant. I know, we're just going through this and just trying to get done. Y'all remember this from Module 1? We'll probably see this again on the exam. So our micronutrients are going to be on the right side of this. If you talk to Dr. Earhart, they would come up with some new ones because we just weren't satisfied with these. We had to come up with something else so that we could have something to study. And so for the most part, everything on the right side of this table is going to be in parts per million, which is very small. You'll typically see that like a half a part per million, which turns out to be like 1 pound per acre. And so that's very difficult to apply. And so what happens is they'll either mix that in as a micronutrient package when you get your fertilizer blended. You can ask for that, or maybe you put that out as a foliar application, because you can just drop a bag in the tank, it will dissolve, and then apply that at the rate that you need. Micronutrients are important. They're like the pennies and the nickels and the dimes that make the dollars. And so if you don't have the micronutrients, some of your cellular functions and some of your metabolic functions, they just don't work properly. And if your metabolic isn't working properly, your plant doesn't grow well. So there's been a little bit more kind of focus on this to make sure like what those actual levels are, especially in this changing environment, as to how much attention we need to pay, how much attention we need to pay to these micronutrients, and do we even need to pay attention to them. But in the end, you're not going to see much difference. Like the research that I've conducted, there hasn't been much difference. I mean, because nitrogen is what makes the plant grow, so they ain't really seen differences in corn or things like that. The micronutrients in the plant are also how we as humans and animals get their nutrients. So we need to make sure that we're applying those in adequate quantity so that the plant is taking them up and then supplying that for those omnivores, herbivores that are taking that up, herbivores. When we're talking about plant nutrient levels, there are a couple of things to define. They kind of make sense. Deficient means there's not enough of it, right? But they had to come up with this specific definition for it. But the thing is that low enough to severely limit yield. And so if y'all remember back to the barrel, when we talked about the law of limiting nutrients, if your micronutrients are limiting, your plant's going to be limited. So we need to make sure that everything is there in adequate supply. Then we have this critical range where the nutrient concentration is a little bit below the yield, but when we apply that nutrient, we do get a yield response. If it's deficient, we would definitely get a yield response, correct? But if it's kind of at that critical range, that's kind of what they call hidden hunger. Like you don't necessarily recognize it until you've already harvested. And then you're like, what happened? Oh, we didn't have enough nutrient there. Again, these make sense, right? Sufficient is optimal. There's enough there in the right supply. Excessive is going to be toxic. We have too much of it, unless it's potassium. And then finally, luxury consumption is just absorbing that nutrient beyond what is necessary for maximum yield. So it's not it doesn't hinder the yield like excessive would. Because if we have an excessive uptake of these plant nutrients, we might end up messing up our yield. Typically like aluminum, manganese might do that, things of that nature, like the ones we think to be toxic. So if you were to do a plant tissue analysis, it would come back as deficient, and you would apply a certain amount of fertilizer, excuse me, that would bring this back up to the critical concentration and finally up to sufficient. So it is right in here, in between where this is deficient and that critical concentration, where we find that hidden hunger. This is kind of like the law of diminishing returns, that once we get up here, we can apply all the nitrogen that we want to, but we're only going to get so much yield return out of it. So that's kind of why knowing what your soil tests are and knowing what your plant tissue analysis is, which is not much different than a soil test, in order to optimize. We're not maximizing anymore. Listen, we're trying to optimize yield. That means the right amount of input that gives us the most amount of profit. And profit isn't necessarily yield. Because if you have to put in $100 and you get $102 out, the profit on that is $2. But if you can put $85 in and get 95 out in yield, the profit's 10. So it's not maximizing yield anymore. We thought that was the goal, to just maximize it. Any of y'all seen those, like whoever can grow the most corn on an acre, that's like 500 bushels per acre, is just an astronomical number. Well, they supplied every possible nutrient in every possible way to make that corn grow 500 bushels per acre. But it's not efficient, and it's not sustainable, both economically and environmentally. So this is where we get into this optimal rather than maximizing. Because putting $100 in to get 2 out, that's not sustainable, not doing it. So those are the things that you might run into in your career. Here's another look at that graph. This is where I was talking about that hidden hunger, and then this law of diminishing returns, that after a certain point, we end up losing money. You can only apply so much nitrogen to the crop. It can only take so much up. Again, another look at this, these micronutrients. Much like potassium, it's mostly in primary and secondary minerals, and the plant is going to take those up in very small amounts. We do have some mineralization and immobilization because the microbes are also needing these micronutrients to perform their cellular functions and metabolic functions. Just not as much as, let's say, nitrogen. And then finally, some of those factors, which are just like everything else that we've been talking about this semester: pH, lime, organic matter, and then those mycorrhizae are going to have a role in that as well. Like, mycorrhizae are our friends. So being able to apply like that might be something that would be beneficial to apply as a package, and like a nutrient package. When you also apply your micronutrients, you put those mycorrhizae in there and they'll help you with that plant uptake. I'm going to step back here for a moment. So these reactions right here, this adsorption and desorption, dissolution and precipitation, those are going to happen pretty quickly. So you might be able to apply a regular iron supplement or some iron or fertilizer, but it's going to instantly either be adsorbed and desorbed in one of these primary or secondary minerals. So you apply it, and then the soil did its thing, because it's looking to get in equilibrium, and it sees iron that binds with that water and forms a secondary mineral or a primary mineral. Now it's not available to the plant. So if you're going to apply these micronutrients, it's important to know that you need to use a chelated form. And not that you need to know the chemical equation for this, but that it needs to be in a chelated form. And so chelate means cloth. And if you'll look right here, in this little, in this plane, the micronutrient is at the center of this plane right here. And so the charge is just enough between nitrogen and oxygen that it kind of holds that thing stable right in the middle. There's enough that holds on to it. And so when it's applied to the soil, it has that water or those hydroxyls Then there is a transformation where that iron can then be taken up by the plant. It holds on to it just long enough that it can be taken up by the plant. But primarily just to know that if you're going to apply micronutrients, look for the chelated form, because it's going to hold on to it and kind of protect it against those adsorption and desorption, solution and dissolution transformations in the soil. All right, I think that's going to do it for today. We will pick up with soil erosion on Wednesday. Might be a good idea to bring your computers to class.